Alright, so welcome back to my lengthy review of Mansfield Park. This is the second part of my review of this novel. In part 1, in the previous video, I talked a little bit about my thoughts on the book in general and delved a little bit deeper into Fanny's character. If you haven't seen that video, it'll be linked in the cards and also in the description box. Please make sure to check it out. In this part 2 of the review, I'm going to talk about all of the other characters, including, of course, Mrs. Norris. And if you want to jump immediately to that section and join me in hating on her a little bit, I completely understand. Feel free to make use of the timestamps. But before I go any further, I want to ask you, do you enjoy this format where I go at length to allow myself to go a bit deeper and broader into the things that I want to talk about in my review? Or do you prefer a more concise kind of chat where I talk about my reading experience in general, like I did with the previous 2 books that I read? Let me know in the comments section below. And while you're there, let me know who's your favorite character in Mansfield Park. Any comments about Mrs. Norris would be particularly welcome. Alright, so let's jump right in with the first set of characters. First, I'm going to talk about Fanny's foster parents, Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram. Lady Bertram is a selfish, lazy woman who likes to sit on the couch all day long, doing nothing and having Fanny sit next to her. She's always going on about how she cannot do without Fanny. And of course what that means is that Fanny has to give up any interest or activity of her own just to remain by her aunt's side, sewing or reading to her. But anyway, you don't get the feeling that Lady Bertram is a particularly bad woman, because she's not. She's just, she just doesn't think beyond herself, and she is really, and I mean really, lazy. Her husband, Sir Thomas, is a more interesting character to talk about. He is an authoritarian, head of family figure. He is very serious and his presence always puts a damp on the spirits of his children. His virtue is supposed to be very high and his scruples are supposed to be very strict. But he is also a slave owner. He is involved in the slave trade, and this is one point that sits uncomfortably in the world of the novel. At one point he has to leave Mansfield Park to take care of this business, and it becomes very clear that the comforts and the riches of Mansfield Park depend so heavily and are built on the exploitation of others elsewhere. I don't want to get into that now because I think I need to read the novel again to really wrap my head around how that fits into everything else and whether it has any bearing on the plot, the characters, and even the relationships between the characters. But what I do want to say is that the fact that Sir Thomas is a slave owner does say something about Sir Thomas himself. The story supposedly takes place at a time after the abolition of slavery in Britain, but before slavery was abolished in the colonies. So you can argue that slavery was considered morally unacceptable. I mean, that is why it was abolished in Britain. And in this intervening period, there must have been discussions and debates that would eventually bring about the end of slavery even abroad. And Sir Thomas, during this period, while far from doing anything illegal and far from being the only one who owned slaves, was nonetheless on the side that chose or thought it okay to own slaves, at least abroad, to secure a comfortable life at home. So perhaps his scruples are not so strict after all, and his sense of virtue is a bit hypocritical. I brought up the time frame and there being at least debates about slave ownership abroad because I don't want it to seem like I'm being too harsh on Sir Thomas or like I'm judging him with hindsight with today's standards. What I'm trying to say is that the topic of slave ownership was a hot topic at the time, and Sir Thomas still chose to be among those who owned slaves. His less than scrupulous sense of virtue and propriety is reinforced when he supports the marriage between his daughter Maria and Mr. Rushworth only because it is advantageous, financially speaking, even though he knows that his daughter does not like and even does not respect Mr. Rushworth. And this happens again with Fanny later on in the novel. But anyway, Sir Thomas does go through something of a redemption arc, especially after he returns from his travel, and it is seen most obviously in his treatment of Fanny. He regrets the way that she had been treated before, and he tries to pay more attention to her and to seek her comfort. He openly praises her, and he even opposes Aunt Norris in her horrible treatment of Fanny. He just becomes like a nice guy in general towards her, and Fanny feels that and she is very grateful to him for it. And towards the end of the novel, he even becomes aware of how wrong he had been in the way he brought up all of his children, not only his foster child. And I think he reaches a point of self-awareness that is sure to make him feel guilty for the rest of his life. Okay, so this went on a bit longer than it should have, so let's pick up the pace a bit. The Bertrams have 4 children. 3 of them, Mariah, Julia, and Tom, are selfish, spoiled, and irresponsible. They are not particularly bad people, but they were brought up in a way to think too much of their own importance, to care more about appearance than substance, and not to really think about the consequences of their actions. And with traits like these, they are sure to encounter troubles in life and to pay the price with varying degrees. And they do. They bring their family into debt and into disgrace, and they go into endless troubles all throughout the book. And these were the ones that Mrs. Norris was afraid would be badly influenced by Fanny. Yeah, right. The 4th cousin is Edmund, and Edmund is Fanny's true friend. He really cares about her, seeks her comfort, and even opposes his mother and his Aunt Norris in their opposition, or try at least to work around and find solutions to their oppositions to Fanny. He is good-natured, good-hearted, and intelligent, and all of these traits are tried and tested throughout the book, especially with the arrival of the Crawfords, and we hang in suspense to know whether in the end he would lose his way or not. And just like everything else in this book, he is an understated character. He does not have the romance or the charm of a Mr. Darcy or a Mr. Tilney, but he has a good heart, good values, and a good head most of the time. But probably if I spent a few moments thinking about his actions and his thoughts, I can make him out to be more selfish and self-centered than what is immediately obvious. But I won't. I like him as he is. But I like this ambiguity in Mansfield Park. Nothing is so black and white. Everything is portrayed so realistically and in a way that is so true to life that it defies simple classification, or it doesn't fit into neat one-line descriptions. Alright, now let's talk about the Crawfords. Henry and Mary Crawford are 2 sexy, careless siblings that arrive on the scene from London and wreak havoc in the lives of the Bertrams. Both of them are very good-looking and very charming. If not good-looking, well, at least their manners are so good, so impeccable, that it made them seem so. I wouldn't say that they are completely responsible for all the troubles that the others go through, because the Bertrams definitely had that trouble in them. They just needed the encouragement of the Crawfords to unleash all of it. And again, I didn't find Henry or Mary particularly evil, but really their flaw mainly is that their morals are a bit compromised. Compromised to what degree, that is a question open for discussion. Their upbringing and early influences made them look at life and deal with the world and with other people in a particular way, a way that is not very laudable, let's say. And whether this can be counteracted by the influence of other people and different, better circumstances, or whether their immorality runs so deep in them as to make them like there is no hope for redemption for them, these are things that the novel definitely raises. I was really rooting for them to prove worthy in the end, or to have the better side of their nature win. But anyway, the ending in this book was too rushed to get a satisfying answer either way. I think Jane Austen was more interested in raising the question of the possibility of being saved and the whole conflict between nature and nurture, and whether later in life you can counteract what you have learned during your childhood. She was more interested, she wanted more to explore all the complexity of that question, more than really finding an answer to it. And towards the end of the novel, it seemed to me like she went, alright, I said everything that I have to say in this novel, so let's wrap things up with an ending of sorts. I know this may not be very true, because I know Jane Austen wrote an alternative ending to this book where things ended very differently, answering that question in a very different way. But in the end, she decided to go with this one. So, anyway, let's move on to Fanny's real parents. Fanny's biological parents make an appearance towards the end of the novel, but she has one brother, William, who comes and visits at Mansfield a few times throughout the book, so we meet him earlier and we get to know him more than the rest. And he is a sweet, up-and-coming young man who is liked by everyone, and his job in the Navy grants him the respect of his family and his friends. Fanny's parents are somewhat disappointing, and so are the vast majority of her siblings. And whether they can be blamed for this, or whether they are the victims of circumstance, again, this is another question that can be open for debate. And now to my favourite character to talk about, Mrs. Norris. To twist the words of Virginia Woolf that I quoted at the beginning of the last video, of all the cruel and vain characters in Jane Austen, Mrs. Norris is the easiest to catch in the act of cruelty and vanity. And I don't think it's even catch, because her vanity and her cruelty just jump out of the words. I am sure she is one of the easiest characters to hate, definitely one of my favorite characters that I love to hate. Remember that evil cat in Harry Potter? Yep. I mean, no wonder she was named after this horrible aunt. Mrs. Norris is shallow, hypocritical, overbearing, and when it comes to Fanny, just downright evil. If it weren't for the language and the irony that Jane Austen used in describing Mrs. Norris and her actions, which gave her due, at least at the textual level, and if it weren't for Fanny's own resilience and strength under that pressure, I think Mrs. Norris's treatment of Fanny can be seen as psychologically abusive. I can kind of accept that all the other characters don't really care about Fanny, they simply forget about her existence and don't care about her wants and needs. That's fine. But Mrs. Norris actually goes out of her way just to make sure that Fanny remains miserable. At times I felt that her whole life and her whole sense of self revolves around standing between Fanny and her happiness. I remember this one scene when Fanny was invited to a dinner and Sir Thomas says that she can have the carriage to take her there and then bring her back home. And Mrs. Norris was just saying to Fanny that she should not expect at all to have the carriage for her convenience. It's completely out of the question. And when she hears what Sir Thomas is suggesting, she is aghast by the idea. She is really shocked to see that Sir Thomas is thinking of Fanny as a human being whose comforts can be of importance. And she tries to reason with Sir Thomas to make him see that there is absolutely no need for this too generous an act. In the end, she contents herself by saying, well, since Edmund is also going to the dinner, the carriage will be used for his own convenience and his own comfort, and not Fanny. Now that I mention it, I remember that Mrs. Norris could not even believe that Fanny could be invited to a dinner in the first place. Who would think of inviting her? Are they insane, or are they just too kind and too courteous? And there are endless examples like these throughout the book, and they were always very funny because they made me just want to take Mrs. Norris and give her a stern talking to, silence her once and for all, and then just enjoy the look of seething anger and indignation on her stupid face. By the way, she was the one who convinced the Bertrams to take on Fanny in the first place, and she promised to be of great help to them, but that help just diminished gradually and dramatically throughout time, reaching in the end a point where she completely absolved herself from any real responsibility towards Fanny. And that is a whole other thing that I can talk about. Imagine people like Aunt Norris existing in real life. Imagine real aunts like Mrs. Norris, her nieces and nephews. Poor creatures. But contained in the fictional world between those two covers, and with the delicious language and irony of Jane Austen, she's great fun. Aside from her treatment of Fanny, I think Mrs. Norris finds the meaning of life in making a fuss about anything and everything. She likes to exaggerate, worry needlessly, and interfere in the business of others. I think that's because it gives her a sense of importance. She likes to see herself occupied, doing stuff, and talking to people for their own good or what she thinks is their own good. But in reality, what she is doing is often very trivial or something that would be better off without her. But she will make sure that everyone sees her heroic deeds and her sacrifices and her achievements. She is also very economical. She has really good skills in personal finances. And this is another source for pride on her part and dismay and annoyance on the part of all the other characters, especially the ones that she does not hesitate to judge and condemn for any appearance of what she considers to be extravagance. But this, if taken in a different light, could be one redeeming character in Mrs. Norris, and if I spent some time thinking about other things, I'm sure I would find a few other redeeming qualities in her. But I won't, because I hate Mrs. Norris, I like her as a horrible character, and I love to hate on her. If everything I have said so far about Mrs. Norris does not do justice to how horrible she is, I will conclude with something that I think really conveys what kind of person Mrs. Norris is to the people around her, and especially to Fanny. There is this one scene where Fanny and her brother William are planning on going on a journey, and Mrs. Norris, for a moment, thinks about joining them on their journey. And when Fanny hears about this, she is horror-struck. These are the words that the narrator chose to use to describe Fanny's feelings on the occasion. She was not disappointed or sad or dismayed or annoyed. No, the idea of spending so much time with Mrs. Norris, being in the same carriage for the length of the journey, struck her with horror. I rest my case. Well, not really my case, because everyone hates Mrs. Norris. And alright, I think this is more than enough about Mansfield Park. I loved the book, and I think in these two videos, I gave it its due. I hope it wasn't too much. And so that is all for today. Please let me know your thoughts on Mansfield Park and about this review in the comments section below. I would love to hear your opinions. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you enjoy this kind of thing, consider subscribing to my channel and turning on the notification bell. And finally, if you have been watching so far, thank you and cheers.